Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to this evening's Bochner Lecture. This is an annual event that commemorates the great polymath Solomon Bochner, who came to Rice as Edgar Odell Lovett Professor of Mathematics in 1968 at the age of 70, after a distinguished post-World War II career at Princeton. 12 years later, he founded Scientia and served as its first director for 2 years until his death in 1982. The first Bochner lecture was held in 1983, so this marks its 30th anniversary. My name is Susan McIntosh, and I have the distinct honor to hold the position that Bochner once held, Director of Scientia. Scientia organizes a monthly lecture series, which has, since the early 1990s, been organized around a theme that permits us to attract speakers from all sectors of the university. This year, in honor of Rice's centennial, we're focusing on the power of ideas. Since ideas and the various processes of inventing, developing, critiquing, testing, transforming, rebutting, and implementing them are the very heart and soul of the university. The Bochner Lecture is traditionally the centerpiece of our series. So for this centennial series and our 30th anniversary, we selected a speaker who has been powerfully engaged with big ideas throughout his distinguished career. Allen J Matusow, the William Gaines Twyman Professor of History, has written several books on 20th century U.S. history, including A History of American Liberalism in the 1960s, a documentary history of the Truman years, and the political economy of Richard Nixon, among others. He is currently preparing a new book on Carter, Reagan, and the end of the Cold War. He joined the Rice faculty in 1963 after receiving his PhD from Harvard and has held the rank of professor since 1970. He served as the Dean of Humanities from 1981 to 1995 and was seconded as Interim Dean of Humanities in 2009-2010. He's been the Academic Affairs Director at the Baker Institute since 2002. Professor Matusow's lecture delivery and teaching style are the stuff of legend. He has won the Brown Award for Superior Teaching so many times that they retired him from the competition with an honorary life teaching award in 1985. He has won the Nicholas Salgo Distinguished Teaching Award twice, the Minnie Stevens Piper Professor Award for faculty in the state of Texas, and in 2011 was a finalist in the Baylor University competition for the Robert Foster Cherry Award for great teaching. That's a nice one. Boy, does that one come with a lot of money. It is with great pleasure and anticipation that I welcome to the podium Allen Matusow, who will be speaking on Zionism, America, and the creation of the State of Israel. Allen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan, for that introduction. Scientia actually has had an amazing career. 30 years have passed since this organization began, and I think there are two reasons for it. First of all, it serves a real function in the university because it does bring people from all corners of the campus together on a number of occasions in a way that no other of our institutions has been able to do, and also because it's had really great leadership, as, for example, Susan herself. So I'm very pleased to be here today, to be the Bochner lecturer. As Susan says, the theme this year is the power of ideas. And since I'm actually not writing at the moment on Carter, Reagan, and the end of the Cold War, but Jimmy Carter in the Middle East, Zionism is an idea that I live with almost every day. And so it was natural for me to select that as my powerful idea. And of course, the other reason is it changed history. I call this lecture America, Zionism, the Creation of the State of Israel. But there's a lot of different things going on here. What I'm going to do is talk a little about Zionism, a little about the creation of the State of Israel, and also I'm going to talk about the interaction of American policy during the end game. Let me begin with a definition of Zionism. By Zionism, I mean a political and secular movement that began at the end of the 19th century that claimed that Jews were a nationality and that they should have their own nation state in a place that was once called Palestine. This was a state that should be, to the extent possible, of, by, and for Jews. Now, to understand the implication of that definition, it's useful to contrast it to the liberal definition, which at least ideally we in the United States claim as our definition of nationality. In America, nationality is not a matter of your religion, your culture, your blood, or your language. It doesn't matter where you come from. As long as you come here legally and swear to uphold our laws, you can become an American. That's the ideal. The actual fact is, the ideal is contradicted as much in the breach as in the reality. And that fact will bear on what I have to say today. So let me begin in the beginning, which is the book of Genesis. Chapter 12. And now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And Abraham took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all of their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. And the Lord appeared unto Abraham, and he said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. The promise of God to Abraham that the land would belong to him. The land of Canaan would belong to him and his seed. That is the origin of the powerful idea that is Zionism. At the time of Joseph, the Jews were driven by famine into Egypt. They were enslaved by the Pharaoh for 400 years. They were led by Moses in a flight out of Egypt. The chariots of the Pharaoh behind them. It was God who opened the Red Sea, parted the Red Sea. The Jews went through, and it was God who closed the waters of the sea over the army of the Pharaoh, and the way was open for the return to Canaan, the land of milk and honey. Around the 11th century, King Saul united all the Jewish tribes and created the Jewish kingdom. After him came David, who defeated the Philistines and extended the boundaries of the kingdom and made Jerusalem its capital. And after him, there came Solomon, who built the second temple, the first temple that housed the covenant of the ark. After that, that was the high point. After that, the kingdom split. Where is this thing here? After Solomon's death in 933 BC, the kingdom split. Israel in the north fell to the Assyrians in 721 before Christ, before the Common Era. Judah fell to Babylon in 586, before the Common Era, and then in succession, the Jews were conquered by the Persians, the Babylonians, and the Romans. In 66, now we're in the Common Era, we used to call it AD, and forgive me if it's hard to break old habits like that. There was a rebellion in what we call Palestine, Judea. The Roman Emperor sent an army, invested Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Romans breached the walls. They destroyed the Second Temple. And in the next 60 years, they killed Jews by the hundreds of thousands and enslaved others of them. And the year 70 AD is a traditional date for the dispersion of the Jews out of Palestine, the beginning of the diaspora. And here is the great achievement, the miracle of Jewish history, that no matter where these people went, no matter how great the temptation was to convert, or how severe the persecutions, they remained Israel, God's chosen people, waiting for the day when he would deliver them to Palestine. By the year 1000, the population in Jerusalem had rebuilt other communities in this area, and then the Crusades came, more slaughter of the Jews. By the 12th century, there were only 1,000 families in and around Jerusalem. As late as 1800, there were no more than 6,000 Jews in this area. And in the mid-19th century, by now the Ottomans have this land. There are 17,000 Jews in Palestine. Now, despite the fact that so few Jews were there, the hold of Palestine on the imagination of the Jewish people was undiminished into the 19th century. A historian named David Stamler wrote in the backdrop of tragedy, "It would be a grave mistake to underestimate the force of this passionate longing, the longing for Palestine. The majority of Jews of Europe lived in the midst of poverty, hatred, and physical restrictions, but the eyes of the Jew rested not on the ghetto walls, they rested on the walls of Jerusalem. His thrice daily prayers were directed there. When he built a house, he left a portion unpainted to remind him that Jerusalem was as yet unbuilt. At the circumcision, mention was made of God's promise to Abraham to give the land of Israel, and at weddings, a glass was crushed to remind those present that as long as the temple was destroyed, unrestrained pleasure was out of place, and in death, a bag of earth from the Holy Land was placed in the grave so that the final resting place might be on sacred soil." Now, the curious thing about this is, despite this hold of Palestine, Zion, on the Jewish imagination, hardly any Jews went there. In the 19th century in Europe, there were two communities, East and West. Most of the Jews in Europe lived in the East, and the 19th century was basically a catastrophe if you were an Eastern European Jew. After the partitions of Poland, most of the Jews lived in the Russian Empire under the Tsars, who were obsessively anti-Semitic. Jews were forced into the Pale of Settlement. They were denied occupations. Their autonomy was undercut, and they were pauperized. And finally, in 1881, the Tsar's government sponsored pogroms against the Jews. And at that point, the inert masses of Eastern European Jewry began to go. And between 1881 and 1914, out of Eastern Europe, there migrated approximately 3 million Jews, most of whom came to the United States. Only 1% of those Jews went to Palestine. So that's a problem, but not a hard one to solve, because throughout Jewish history, the idea of Zion was a religious idea. It was a religious conception. It would be God who would deliver the Jews by a miracle outside of history to the land that God had promised Abraham. Zionism becomes a world historical force only when it is totally transformed, when it becomes a political and secular idea. And that idea was that the Jews should deliver Palestine by their own agency inside of history, and do it now. This idea began to stir among Eastern European Jewry in the 1880s, but it found its leadership among Western Jews, Western European Jews, who had an entirely different evolution in the 19th century. This is a period of great hope and promise for Western European Jewry, whose communities were much smaller than the Eastern European Jews. This was the century of emancipation. The French Revolution was built on the ideas of the Enlightenment in 1791. The French National Assembly knocked down the walls of the ghetto, and wherever the armies of Napoleon went, the ghettos were similarly destroyed. And Jews were now able to join the polities in which they lived. And they embraced this with a passion. They were no longer Israel. They were Frenchmen, or they were Germans, or they were Italians, who happened to have a religion that was called Judaism. And Judaism itself underwent drastic changes. In Germany especially, there was a movement to reform Judaism, which meant that you are going to get rid of unseemly medieval rituals. You dispense with Zion, you dispense with the Messiah, and you're going to base Judaism no longer on the law, the Mosaic law and its obedience, but on the teachings of the prophets, a form of Judaism that is radically severed from historic Judaism, but entirely appropriate to the project of assimilation. The problem with this was that the more prosperous the Jews became, and the greater their contribution was to the cultures in which they resided, and it was way out of proportion to their numbers, the more anti-Semitism increased. By the end of the 19th century, we're in a period of intense nationalism in Europe. And that nationalism took the form of anti-Semitism. The Jew was the alien, the Jew was the other. And the entire assimilation, the emancipation project was thrown in doubt. Political parties were running on anti-Semitic platforms, and political candidates were winning by running as anti-Semites. And this created a kind of crisis. In France, this achieved its most dramatic expression in the case of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, and that is my first slide up there. In 1894, Dreyfus was the first Jew ever to be on the staff of the French army. An anti-Semitic colleague framed him on a charge of selling secrets to Germany. He was tried and found guilty. In January of 1895, Dreyfus stood in the courtyard of the École Militaire while they broke his sword and pulled the buttons from his uniform. And outside, a mob screamed, "Death to the Jews! Death to the Jews!" And one of those who witnessed the humiliation of Captain Dreyfus that day was Theodore Dreiser, who was the father of modern Zionism. He was an unlikely candidate to play that role. He was born in 1860 in Budapest of a German Jewish family that was assimilated, reform, liberal, prosperous. In 1878, the family moved to Vienna, and in time, Herzl fulfilled the goal of his family, which was to become a leader of German culture. He wrote plays, was a pretty successful playwright in Vienna. He was a journalist. In 1892, one of the leading Viennese newspapers sent Herzl to Paris to be the foreign correspondent. At this point, he has no interest in Jewish subjects. He has basically no Jewish identity. He is an assimilated Jew. But eventually, the problems of the Jews in Europe, the emancipated Jew, became a problem he could not avoid. And in time, Herzl became obsessed with how to solve this problem. Around the time of the Dreyfus humiliation, the answer came to him as in a flash of illumination. The solution to the problems of the Jews in Europe was to have a state of their own. As he said in his diary, "We need the promised land where we can have hook noses, black or red beards, and bow legs without being despised for it, where we can live at last as free men on our own soil, and where we can die peacefully in our own fatherland. There we can expect the award of honor for great deeds so that the offensive cry of Jew may become an honorable appellation like German, Englishman, Frenchman. In brief, like all civilized people. For surely God would not have kept us alive so long if there were not assigned to us a specific role in the history of mankind. The Jewish state is a world need. I believe, for me, life has ended and world history begun." In 1896, Herzl published a thin pamphlet called The Jewish State, and it had a basically simple argument. Assimilation had failed. The Jew would always be the other. He would always be the alien. And by implication, he would always be in danger. And that being true, the Jews had to have a state of their own. He was an outstanding publicist, but mainly he was a man of action. And under his leadership, the next year in 1897, there occurred the first World Zionist Congress held in Basel. There were about 200 delegates from 16 countries. Most of them were Eastern Europeans, so poor that Herzl actually had to pay their expenses. And when he appeared on the platform, these Jews gave him a nearly hysterical ovation. An observer said that it was as if he was the new Messiah, the new King of the Jews. He was a handsome man. He was regal, theatrical, and he lived up to this occasion. The Congress passed a resolution that said Zionism seeks to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured homeland in Palestine. There it is, the goal. Herzl wrote in his diary afterwards, "If I were to sum up the Basel Congress in a single phrase, I would say, in Basel, I created the Jewish state. Were I to say this aloud, I would be greeted by universal laughter. But perhaps 50 years hence, everyone will perceive it." Now, the thing to understand about Zionism at this point, it's basically a movement of eccentric Jews and doesn't have that much traction. There is much opposition to it. Orthodox rabbis accused the movement of blasphemy. Reform rabbis accused it of disloyalty to the fatherland. By the fatherland, they meant Germany. Herzl's idea to realize this project was to get the backing of a great power. Palestine, the area there's an interesting thing about the Jewish state. Actually, Herzl himself didn't care where it was. And in the book, The Jewish State, he mentions Palestine. He also mentions Argentina. But his followers wanted only one place. Meantime, he has to find great power backing to induce the Sultan to create a homeland for the Jews. And remarkably, he gets entree into the capitals of the world and he sees the Kaiser. He sees the Sultan. He goes to St. Petersburg, and he interviews the very Russian leaders who had sponsored the pogroms against the Jews, because they both have the same point of view, which is it would be great if the Jews would leave Russia. He goes to Britain, and he thinks of asking for Cyprus. And the British think of maybe giving him Uganda. Nothing works. In 1904, at the age of 44 years old, broken in health, Herzl died, his project totally unrealized. After that, leadership passed to Chaim Weizmann, who had a remarkable career. He was a Yiddish-speaking Jew from the Pale of Settlement, but also a great scientist. He studied chemistry in Berlin, got a PhD or its equivalent in Switzerland, and in 1905 he took up a post in the University of Manchester. He was such a great scientist that he made tremendous contributions to the British war effort and became the director of the laboratories of the Admiralty. World War I changed everything so far as the Zionists were concerned, because Turkey lined up with the Germans. And therefore, as everyone understood, the Ottoman Empire was going to be finished. And the British and the French were going to descend on it to pick up the pieces, with the British eventually getting Palestine. So, Weizmann uses his entree into the leadership of Great Britain to promote his real passion, which is Zionism. And among his converts were Lloyd George and Lord Balfour. And it so happened that in 1917, Lloyd George was the prime minister and Lord Balfour was the foreign minister. They were converts, converted by Weizmann to the Zionist idea. They had reasons of state to do this. They were going to beat the Germans, who were also, they thought, thinking about the same idea. They would win some Jewish support. They would have a Jewish colony that would protect the entrance of the Suez Canal. But the real reason was they were Christian Zionists. They believed that the same God who had promised Canaan to Abraham was their God. And they were also conscious of the crimes that had been committed against the Jews in Christendom, and they wanted to expiate the guilt. And so they were prepared to endorse the idea of Zionism out of nowhere. This idea, which must have seemed to most people totally insane in the mid-1890s, is going to come to fruition. But first, the British government wants to check it with Woodrow Wilson. In September of 1917, he's asked what he thinks of this. Wilson says, well, I think this violates the principle of self-determination, namely Arab rights, and so he was against it. But then they ask him a month later, and he gives them the green light, because by now, Louis Brandeis, who wrote his campaign speeches in 1912, and who became, thanks to Wilson, the first Jewish member of the Supreme Court, and a recent convert to Zionism, gets to Wilson and changes Wilson's mind. So on November the 2nd, 1917, Lord Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild. This was the first great victory of Zionism. It was one paragraph long, one sentence long, actually, after the salutation, and it did change history. It said, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. A qualification. It being duly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Well, first of all, what is a national home? When Weizmann first saw this, he was disappointed. I mean, there's nothing implied here about a Jewish state. It could be a haven. It could be a state. It was vague. And then there's this thing about the rights of the indigenous. And it began to occur to people that there's a contradiction here. The early Zionists, like Herzl himself, hardly thought of the Arabs. And when they thought of the Arabs, they assumed that the Arabs would be grateful for the arrival of the Jews who would bring them prosperity. They never made a bigger mistake. In 1920, the British take over the administration of Palestine. They endorse immigration of Jews to a homeland. In 1921, there are riots against the mandate. In 1929, there are bigger riots against the mandate. The question is exactly what were they rioting against? Because the truth was, in the 1920s, Zionism was falling flat. There were people who said that the Jews would come there by the hundreds of thousands. More realistically, maybe 100,000. The lowest estimate was 30,000. The average net migration into Palestine by Jews in the 1920s was 8,000. And the flood of money that they expected to use to build Jewish institutions there turned out to be a trickle. This is still a minority movement. It is still criticized by much of the Jewish world. It's on the margin. The man who actually made Zionism what it became was, of course, Adolf Hitler, who became the Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, and almost immediately began his war against the Jews. In 1933, there were 500,000 Jews in Germany, which was 1% of the population. And he began to impose his disabilities against the German Jews. At that point, immigration into Palestine begins to build. In 1932, there were 12,500 migrants into Palestine from Europe. 1933, 37,000. 1934, 45,000. 1935, 66,000. In 1918, the Jews were 10% of the population of Palestine. By 1935, they're almost 30% of the population, and now the Arabs are truly alarmed. And there is a great Arab uprising against the mandate and against the Jews. The British have to send an army to put the rebellion down. They put a temporary clamp on immigration to calm the Arabs down. And, of course, they send a royal commission to take a look at the whole problem. In May of 1939, the Royal Commission issued a white paper which marked the end of Balfour. You're on the verge of World War II. You need the Arabs. And what's the sense of irritating them with the Jews? And so the white paper called for only 15,000 Jewish migrants into Palestine over the next 5 years, and then no more unless the Arabs agreed, which of course they wouldn't, and then it would be over. And the white paper also called for independence of Palestine in 10 years. Well, now it would be an Arab state because it was an Arab majority. The whole project had come to a halt. But you have to remember what the date is. You're right on the eve of the Second World War, and you're right on the eve of the final solution. So the question was, in this hour of its peril, where could the Jews go? Well, before World War I, they came to the United States. They came by the hundreds of thousands and ultimately by a few million. That was the period of open immigration. In the first decade of the 20th century, 10 million Europeans came here. In the single year of 1907, 1,200,000 immigrants came to the United States. We did not reach that number again until very recently in a much bigger population. But the immigration caused a reaction, a backlash, especially among the Anglo-Saxon elite, which thought that these Eastern European Jews who were coming in such great numbers would pollute the Anglo-Saxon blood. And that became the chief rationale for the 1924 Immigration Act, a truly epical act. It essentially closed the door. That is, European immigration to the United States would be limited to 150,000 a year. Remember, 15 years ago, it was over 1 million, 150,000 a year. And then they devised a quota system that allotted quotas to the various countries of Europe. The biggest quotas were to England and Germany, where they had good blood, and tiny quotas to the Eastern and Southern European states, where most of the Jews lived. So now you're in the late 30s. You're in a moment of crisis, and where are the Jews going to go? They couldn't come to America. None of the Western countries wanted to receive them. There is, by the late 30s, a refugee crisis. Half the German Jews fled. Now the Nazis are in Vienna, and there are more refugees. And Hungarian Jews are being kicked out of Slovakia. There is a vast stateless population on the margins of Europe, and it aroused the humanitarian concerns of people around the world. And President Franklin Roosevelt responded to this by calling for an international conference attended by some 30 countries in Evian, France, in the summer of 1938. The idea was to address the statelessness of these refugees. Pretty much the United States killed Roosevelt's own conference by announcing that it had no intention of changing its quota law. And one by one, all the countries explained why they could not change their immigration law. The only country there that actually showed some interest in rescuing the Jews was the Dominican Republic. And so there was no place to go. September of 1939, World War II begins. And in 1941, there was the beginning of the final solution. Last 6 months of 1941, the Nazis killed 600,000 Jews. In 1942, they killed 900,000 Jews. And the interesting question is, what was the policy of the United States here? The policy of the United States was to keep as many immigrants, as many refugees, as many Jews as possible out of the country. Roosevelt, this was a hot potato. He kicked it over to the State Department. As it happened, from 1940 to 1944, the Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the issuance of visas, among other things, was Breckinridge Long. Breckinridge Long was an upper-class American, a friend of Roosevelt's, and an anti-Semite. As he said in his diary, Mein Kampf is eloquent in opposition to Jewry, extreme radicals, professional agitators, and refugee enthusiasts. And so it was Breckinridge Long who sent orders to the consuls in Europe to interpret the law in the most restrictive way to keep these people out. And it's estimated that between 1938 and 1942, 75,000 Jewish refugees who might have been admitted under the existing quotas, if they had been liberally interpreted, never got here. What happened to them, we don't know. There's a lot more to that particular story. I don't have time for that. World War II ends. Before it ended, there's one other detail to add to this. The World Zionist Congress held a meeting in the Biltmore Hotel in New York in the summer of 1942. And there, the leadership of the Zionist movement passed from Chaim Weizmann to Ben-Gurion, from the pro-British Wiseman to Ben-Gurion, who was on the ground in Palestine and was the head of the Jewish agency, and who was ready to state boldly what the purpose of Zionism was. And this was a resolution passed then. Zionism, it said, the new world order that will follow victory cannot be established unless the problem of Jewish homelessness is finally solved. The conference urges that the gates of Palestine be opened, that the Jewish agency be vested with control over immigration, and that Palestine be established as a Jewish commonwealth integrated into the structure of the new democratic world. A Jewish commonwealth means a Jewish state. The war ends, and the Zionist movement has two demands. First of all, open Palestine to immigration, and second of all, create there a Jewish state. The obstacle to this is the British. They still have the mandate. They're still following the policy of the White Paper of 1939. They don't want any Jewish immigrants in Palestine because the whole place will blow up. The Arabs won't take it. And they don't want a Jewish state. They've had enough of that. So if these things are going to happen, the Zionists are going to have to get the Americans on their side. The Americans have all the power. The British are weak, dependent on our aid. And America becomes the focus. The president was Harry Truman, who had a genuine sympathy for the Jews. But he's the head of a government that is badly divided. On the one hand, there's the national security bureaucracy, the War Department, the State Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To a man, they are opposed to Zionism because it was not, they thought, in the interest of the United States to alienate the Arabs. In June of 1946, the Joint Chiefs submitted a memo that says, as to the importance of a stable Middle East friendly to the Western powers, it is obvious that this area is the buffer between Russia and the British Mediterranean lifeline, meaning the Suez Canal. If the peoples of the Middle East turn to Russia, this would have the same impact in many ways as would military conquest of this area by the Soviets. For a very serious consideration from a military point of view is control of the oil of the Middle East. This is probably the one large undeveloped reserve in the world which may come to its limits of its oil resources within this generation without having developed any substitute. A great part of our military strength, as well as our standard of living, is based on oil. To counterbalance the national security bureaucracy, there were Truman's political advisors. There's no doubt that they were sympathetic to Zionism, but they were also keenly aware of the domestic power, politically, of Jews. 65% of America's 5.5 million Jews after World War II lived in New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois with 110 electoral votes, and there were no Arabs there to counter it. And so they were leaning on Truman in the Zionist direction. The immediate demand of the World Zionist Movement and the Jewish Agency was for admission of 100,000 Jews into Palestine. On August 31st, 1945, Truman decided to back this demand, 100,000 Jews, immediately. The British are stunned because not only has Truman advocated a policy that they were against, he included a statement that said the United States will accept no financial or military responsibility for whatever the consequences were. The British were going to be stuck with this. And so they prevailed upon Truman to take it off the table, and let's have a study. So that's what they do. There is an Anglo-American committee that's sent to the Middle East to investigate the problem. In April of 1946, the Anglo-American Commission unanimously endorsed 100,000 Jewish refugees immediately in Palestine, though it did come out against the creation of a Jewish state. British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin said in mid-June of 1946, regarding the agitation in the United States for 100,000 Jews to be put into Palestine, I hope it will not be misunderstood in America if I say, with the purest of motives, that that was because they did not want too many of them in New York. Bevin rejected the demand for 100,000 Jews to be admitted into Palestine because, he said, I would have to put another division of British troops in there, and I am not prepared to do it. Meantime, there's this problem of the Jews in Europe. Before the war, people imagined millions of European Jews going to Palestine. There are no more millions of European Jews. Of the 6 million Jews who lived in Europe before World War II, 5 million of them were dead. 750,000 of them lived in Eastern Europe under conditions where if they had their choice, they would get out. The immediate problem was the displaced persons in Western Europe. By the end of 1946, there were 1 million displaced persons in British and American displaced persons camp. 100,000 of them were Jews, and of those, 40,000 were survivors of the death camps. Finally, on December the 23rd, this turns out to be an important date, 1945, Truman issues an executive order in which he says that all unused quotas, unused immigration quotas for Europe, those quotas should be filled with displaced persons. Well, that was Jews and non-Jews. As it turned out, only a trickle of the Jewish DPs got into the country. By that means, in 1946, the DP, the displaced persons population in these camps increased from 100,000 to 200,000. Now, the reason for that, let's say, is extraordinary. During the outset of World War II, many of the Jews in Poland fled to the Soviet Union. Now the war was over, and about 150,000 of them come drifting back into Poland, where there were hardly any Jews left. But the appearance of these returned Jewish Poles initiated anti-Semitism in Poland, and after all that had happened, pogroms. Who can explain a thing like that? I cannot. Between September and December of 1945, there were 26 minor pogroms in Poland, and in 1946 it got worse. As Leonard Dinnerstein, who's a historian of these things, said, anti-Semites ransacked synagogues in Krakow, shot patients in a Lublin hospital, and randomly pulled Jews from trains and stoned or killed them. July the 4th, 1946, in Kielce, a city near Warsaw, mobs beat 75 Jews. They murdered 41, and then they mutilated their bodies. The one Catholic priest in all of Poland that spoke out against this was silenced by the cardinal. So not surprisingly, the Jews began to filter out. They wanted to go to Palestine, but if they didn't get to Palestine, they would wind up in these camps, which is why the population of Jews in these camps doubled. It wasn't until 1947 that Congress took up the problem of displaced persons. And in July of 1948, when it was too late, they passed the Displaced Persons Act. This act would admit 200,000 displaced persons over the next 2 years. Displaced persons could be Jews or non-Jews. The interesting thing about this act is it was an anti-Semitic act. Congress is controlled by Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans. They didn't like Jews. And so they passed an immigration act which they knew was designed to keep the Jewish displaced persons out of the United States. among its provisions was one that gave preference to 40% of these slots to Baltic peoples in these camps. The Baltic peoples who came to Germany during World War II were escaping the Nazis, by escaping the Soviets, and were basically sympathetic to the Nazis. Some of them were even guards in the concentration camp. They would have preference. 30% would have to be agricultural workers. That pretty much eliminated Jews. But here was the real kicker. If you were a displaced person who entered one of those camps after December the 23rd, 1945, you were not eligible. And by then, 90% of all the displaced persons in those camps had come after that date. And the Congress knew it. When Truman signed the act, he said, "In its present form, this bill is flagrantly discriminatory. The terminal date discriminates in callous fashion against displaced persons of the Jewish faith. The only reason Truman could surmise for the choice of the date was, quote, upon the abhorrent ground of intolerance." Hardly any of the Jews actually got here during this period. One of the historians of this refugee problem, Malcolm Proudfoot, wrote, "It is possible that if the immigration laws of the United States and of several other countries of the world had not been so restrictive, the great majority of those European Jews who migrated to Israel would have been glad to go elsewhere. Had this happened, the large-scale support given by American Jews for Israel might never have been forthcoming. It is even possible that the state of Israel would not have been established. If this is so, then Israel may be seen less as a creation of Zionism and the desire to establish a sovereign Jewish state than as the choice of necessity arising out of unreasonable worldwide barriers to Jewish immigration." That's the story of immigration to Palestine, but there was this other issue about creating a Jewish state. Truman stayed away from it as long as he could, and he finally came out with a position on the eve of the congressional election of 1946. The Democrats are going to get creamed. In New York, is going to be a disaster. Governor Thomas E. Dewey, the presumptive candidate for the Republican nomination in 1948, is running on a very pro-Zionist platform, and Truman is under tremendous political pressure to do something. And so he's going to issue a statement on October the 4th, 1946, which was Yom Kippur. In Britain, the foreign minister gets wind of this, and he goes to the Secretary of State, who was there at the time, and he asks for a delay in the issuance of this statement. The Secretary of State Burns said that if Truman didn't speak out, New York's Governor Dewey would. So, on the eve of Yom Kippur, October the 4th, 1946, Truman took note that the Jewish Agency had proposed creation in Palestine of a viable Jewish state in control of its own immigration. Quote, "It is my belief that a solution along these lines would command the support of the public in the U.S." It's a weak statement, but there it was. For the first time, an American president had endorsed the Jewish, the idea of a Jewish state. The Democrats lost New York anyway. In the House of Commons, Foreign Minister Bevin said, "I really must point out that in international affairs, I cannot settle things if my problem is made the subject of local elections." In February 1946, the British, they can't handle this anymore. They turn it over to the UN. The UN appoints the UN Special Commission on Palestine, and it made its report on August the 21st, 1947. It was the second great victory of Zionism, the first being Balfour, the second, this report of the committee. The report called for the partition of Palestine and the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state. The question was, what was the United States going to do about this? It was pretty clear that unless the United States actively backed it, it would probably fail. At first, the State Department prevails upon Truman to just give a lukewarm endorsement, but in the last minute, he unleashes a lobby, and the partition resolution passes November the 29th, 1947. I can find it okay here. That's Ben-Gurion. That's a displaced persons camp. And you can see them holding a Jewish flag. There was the map that accompanied the partition resolution of November of 1947. The lighter areas will be the Arab state, and the darker areas will be the Jewish state. Well, you can see this is an absolutely useless map for anything practical. The purpose of the cartographers was to separate as many Jews as possible from as many Arabs as possible. They were not too successful because in the Jewish portion of the partition, there would be 520,000 Jews and 320,000 Arabs. Privately, Ben-Gurion said, there can be no stable and strong Jewish state as long as it has a majority of only 60%. But the principle had been endorsed, and so the Jews welcomed this resolution. The Arabs say, you're asking us to give away our own country. We've been here since the 7th century. Why should we give this up? And they reject the partition, and almost immediately a war breaks out. A civil war inside of the mandate. In the March of 1948, with this war raging there, the Truman administration reconsiders. It's been responsible, if anybody was, for the success of the partition resolution, but instead of bringing peace, it brought war, and so the UN, the American ambassador, proposes a suspension of partition and the imposition of a temporary trusteeship on Palestine until this thing could be straightened out. On the ground in Palestine, Ben-Gurion said, "It is we who will decide the fate of Palestine. We cannot agree to any sort of trusteeship, permanent or temporary. The Jewish state exists because we defend it." Meantime, this thing is coming to a climax. The British are going to abandon the mandate on May the 15th, 1948. And at that point, the Jews are going to declare the existence of a state they would call Israel. By April, the Jews had won the Civil War. They smashed, by then, the Arab resistance, and the Arab community in the Jewish zone disintegrated. On the eve of partition, the American position officially was still, let's have this trusteeship, but that wasn't going to work. And now there is an intense debate inside the American government about what to do when this state is actually created. Shall the United States recognize it or not? On May the 12th, 1948, Truman held a meeting in his office to hear both sides conduct the argument. His political advisor, chief political advisor, was Clark Clifford, and Clifford was there to say that we had to beat the Russians to the punch, so we better recognize Israel. His real reason was, you're right, on the eve of the 1948 presidential election. And his motives are pretty clearly political. His opponent was Secretary of State George Catlett Marshall, who had been Chief of Staff of the Army in World War II, and whom Truman called the greatest living American. And Marshall was there to tell him not to recognize the Jewish state. He recorded his remarks when the meeting was over. He said, "I remarked to the President that speaking objectively, I thought Mr. Clifford's suggestions would have precisely the opposite effect from that intended by Mr. Clifford. The transparent dodge to win a few votes would not, in fact, achieve its purpose. the great dignity of the office of the president would be seriously diminished. The counsel offered by Mr. Clifford was based on domestic political considerations, while the problem that confronted us was international. I said bluntly that if the president were to follow Mr. Clifford's advice, and if in the fall election I were to vote, I would vote against the president. The whole room became totally quiet, and the meeting broke up. Next day, the White House got on the phone and they convinced Marshall to go along. So at 11 minutes after 6, on the evening of May 14th, 11 minutes after the State of Israel was declared, Truman recognized the State of Israel. There is the map of Palestine when the war was over. You can see that the Jewish state, which was a little more than 50% of the area in 1947, had been expanded by conquest to 78% of the area. Jordan, because of a deal that was made between the Jewish agency and King Abdullah, got the West Bank. Of the Arab state that was supposed to be created, nothing remained. The major consequence of the war was the creation of the Arab refugees. When the war began, there were about 1,200,000 Arabs in Palestine, and about half that number of Jews. When the war was over, 700,000 of the Arabs who lived in what was now the Jewish state were gone. Some of them fled early, some of them left in fright, and many of them were driven out by the Israeli army under the guise of military necessity. 700,000 were gone. It was decided in June of 1948 that they were not going to be allowed back. And to make sure they did not come back, the Israelis destroyed 500 of the Arab villages inside the boundaries of the Jewish state. And that was the major legacy of the war. So, in the end, what can we say about this? We can say that who could not have sympathy for the Arabs? They had not committed these genocidal crimes against the Jews. And when the war was over, everybody's insisting that on this small and unpromising piece of the earth, they had to bear the entire burden of absorbing the surviving remnant. And when they fought that, and they were driven from their homes and denied re-entrance, the right of return, it is not surprising they thought that they too were the victims of a crime. And who could not have sympathy for the Jews? Herzl was right. Their position was in danger. But not even Herzl could imagine the crime that would be committed against them. And so when the surviving remnant had no place else to go except Palestine, who could blame them for going there? I would argue that both the Arabs and the Jews were victims. And they were victims of the great powers, some of whom murdered the Jews and the others of whom would not rescue them. And it was the inhumanity of the great powers, and that includes the United States, that really gave power to the idea of Zionism and brought to fruition its project, which was the creation of the State of Israel on May the 15th, 1948. So if you got some questions out there, comments, whatever, go ahead.
Calvin said we're going to run the next, okay?
Yeah. You want to do that or what?
I've got two people. Because we are recording this, we need to get a mic up to you when you want to ask a question. So will the two students who are going to run these mics, one up this way and one up that way, come and get them. And Professor Matusow will recognize the questioners, but please wait for the mic to get to you.
I covered 3,000 years. There has to be some question somewhere. Yeah. What have I done for you lately? Yeah, Deborah.
Alan, we've heard you speak so eloquently on so many topics about American history and the American presidents in the 1960s and liberalism, and it's a little bit shocking to hear you talk about a new project like this, and wonderful. What was it that brought you to this, to studying this, which is clearly a movement? It's still about the U.S. presidents, but it's really taking on something really messy and complex. And what made you do it?
Well, you know, I grew up, half my family is Jewish. And I grew up in a Zionist environment. And I uncritically accepted the Zionist point of view. And it wasn't really until I was a full professor at university in the early 70s, that I began to see the complexity of this thing. And when I saw the complexity of it, I became fascinated. So this is not something that I discovered recently. I've been interested in this for years. And my interest was deepened by the trips I've made to Jerusalem for the USIA, for the Baker Institute. Once I went with a bunch of Episcopalians, which was a really exciting thing, and I mean that sincerely. And there is, and this I think, they talk about Jerusalem fever, and it's true. If you go there, the magic of the place takes hold of you. And I think my experiences there, walking through the old city and seeing all that ancient history concentrated, and all the current tensions that are evident there, you don't have to have that great a historical imagination to be absolutely wrapped up in the subject. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could comment about two sanctuaries that were offered during the Second World War. One was the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, and the other was Shanghai.
Yeah. Yeah, I read that the other day, and actually I didn't know anything about it. Rich, do you know why Shanghai was a refuge?
Well, it was a pre-existing Jewish community aside from that.
Yeah. No, but I was fascinated when I saw it. And if I knew you were going to be here, I would have looked up the answer. Neil, did I see your hand there? Oh, yeah.
Alan, around this time, many of the most influential scientists in the U.S. had come from Europe, and a large fraction of those were Jews. Truman didn't like scientists, but I'm wondering whether this group made an effort to influence democratic politics during that time with regard to Jewish issues.
I don't know of anything particular that the Jewish scientists did. They may have done something, but the point of it was there wasn't really much to do. When they had the Evian Conference in 1938, there was a poll about how many Americans were interested in taking German Jews in the United States. 17% were. And one of the little appreciated things of World War II was the intensity, the rising intensity of anti-Semitism, all during the war. The Democrats have the Jewish vote sewed up. They don't really have to do anything. And they didn't.
In your description of the late 19th century
Yeah.
and the move from a more liberal environment to anti-Semitism, can you, I know you expressed that the Jews had been very successful and were wealthy, but why? I mean, it just doesn't add up for me. Why all over this part of the world anti-Semitism came to life at that time?
Well, it raises a larger question of why there's anti-Semitism, and that is actually not an easy question to answer. I mean, they were different. And you could assimilate, but people knew you were Jewish. And you got 2,000 years of anti-Semitic history in Europe. And so the more prominent the Jews became, and I'm making this up because I don't really have an answer, the more prominent they became, the more resentment they generated. And so when you have an intense nationalism, which is a definition, nationalism is the way of drawing boundaries, of describing who you are as opposed to who they are. And the Jews didn't fit. Perhaps somebody who's a European historian might comment further on that. Marty, do I see you there hiding out?
You want to take that?
Sure. Well, nationalism, in a sense, is to blame. Once 19th century was an era of nationalism, and once everybody defined themselves as a German, a Frenchman, or whatever, it left one group out, the Jews, who had no nation, and nobody really thought that they belonged. Where Germans said they're not really Germans, and the French said they're not really French, and so forth. So they didn't belong anywhere.
That's my message. Confirmed by somebody who really knows what he's talking about. Yeah. Go ahead. Tom.
This may need to be the last question.
While the United States was not being receptive to Jewish needs to immigrate to the United States during the war, how much did we really know about the final solution?
Yeah.
What was going on during that time?
Right. The State Department tried to repress news of the final solution. There was a press report I read the other day in late 1942, but I remember once looking up in the New York Times where this story finally gets reported. And it was like page 14 in the middle of 1943. It was simply not a story. Nobody was interested in it. As amazing as that is. Yeah.
One more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Hi, I thank you for your talk. It was a very good historical overview. I was wondering, you defined the 48 war as a civil war, and you also mentioned conquest. I was just wondering how you define civil war in that context.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Arabs had an army of irregulars, and they attacked the Jews. And at one point, it looked like they were going to win. But the tide turned early in April, and but it's an actual war. They have weapons. They're shooting at people. You know, they're shooting each other. That's my definition of war. But
Well,
I have a feeling you
well,
mean something
this is
else.
not really the idea I had of the 48 war. I don't. I mean, maybe we can talk about this.
I think I understand your question.
Or civil war versus...
Yeah, right. Right,
Colonialization. This how
Yeah, there are two wars. There's the Civil War that's over in April. In the meantime, reluctantly, the Arab states intervened. That is, after the creation of the State of Israel, Lebanon, was it Lebanon? Iraq, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, 5 states mobilize to end the Jewish state after it's declared. There are about 30,000 all told. They're poorly led, they're uncoordinated, and the Jews smash them up. So I understand that there's two wars, and I didn't make that clear. There are two wars that go on there. There's this early war that's a civil war, and then a second war, which I guess you could describe as international war. Nate, you want to say something?
Yeah. My question was, okay, I thought it was a good historical overview as well. Thank you. There's the tension between whether you talk about the great powers and great power strategy versus the influence of the domestic sort of the Zionist lobby. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what drives the relationship with Israel? Is it more U.S. geostrategic strategy, or do you think that the lobby is behind, or is at the heart of the relationship?
Well, it depends. I think the Jewish lobby had a big influence on domestic politicians in '48. I didn't go into that, but there's significant evidence regard to that. But if you get to the Eisenhower administration, they weren't getting they weren't getting Jewish votes. And in fact, in '56, the Eisenhower administration threatened sanctions against Israel unless it gives back Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, which very reluctantly Ben-Gurion did. So if you go through the administrations, it's not really that. Even Kennedy, at one point, was trying to pursue a neutral policy, and he got in trouble with the Jews. Johnson was very close to the Jews, and it was Johnson who decided in '67 that the Jews, the Israelis, did not have to give back the conquered territories from the '67 war unless they got peace treaties. So unlike Eisenhower, who forced the Israelis to disgorge their conquest, Johnson facilitated their retention. I'll just tell you one last thing, though, about this. This comes out of my Carter research. When I was at the Carter Library, I found an utterly fascinating document. Carter, when he got into office, the biggest thing he wanted to do was become the peacemaker in the Middle East. Now, the truth of it was he knew nothing about it. And he was politically naive. Now, he would learn a lot, including a lot about politics. But through the first half of 1977, he is increasingly irritating the American Jewish community. So his chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, wrote him a memo in June of 1946, and he says, look, we're from Georgia. I mean, this is like the labor movement. We didn't understand that 4 years ago, and we don't understand this. So let me tell you what the facts of life are. The facts of life are that Jews vote in concentrated numbers, and that's significant. But here's the real thing. 60% of the big contributors to the Democratic Party in 1976 were Jewish contributors. And 60% of Nixon's contributors in 1972 were Jewish contributors. And that's why Senator Dole, who comes from Kansas, where there's hardly any Jews, pays attention to the Jewish issues because of the contributions he gets there. And because of this, you can count on 65 to 75% of senators on any issue involving Israel and Jews to back up the Israeli point of view. And for that reason, Mr. President, you're not going to be able to have a comprehensive settlement as you want. And in fact, Carter never got it. So in that particular case, and it's all over. They lose contributions in 78, and I mean, the influence of the Jewish lobby as Carter tries to make peace is tremendous. But there are other administrations that have other stories. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I do want to thank Allen Matusow so much for that wonderful overview that provides an historical context for the world that we live in now, and many of the things that continue to percolate. And wish you good luck on getting that book done, which I think at this point we're all eager to read. I also want to thank you all for coming. I'm sure many of you have questions that you wanted to ask, and we do have a reception out here where you can mingle and ask Professor Matusow any of your questions or share your comments with each other. I hope you'll do that, and I hope also that we will see you at our next Scientia afternoon colloquium on February 12th on the power of ideas. Thank you again.
How do I get this thing out of here?
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.